Let's talk about racism, and not the real one. That one is frankly boring to talk about. I mean the fantasy one. Have you ever read a book or played a game or watched a movie where, let's say for example, humans treat some other race like shit or in general act with prejudice towards them in one way or another? For some reason this always annoyed me to no end, and while rambling about RWBY, I've gotten myself a good way to demonstrate why. Okay, so in RWBY there are two sentient races, the humans and faunus, which are essentially humans with certain animal traits and features. And as you could probably guess, they are being discriminated against. So much so that an entire militarized activist group was formed, even though we don't really see much of this so-called discrimination on screen. And this is one of my biggest nitpicks when it comes to fantasy depictions of racism. Humans acting like dicks to objectively superior races. Think for a second here. Faunus are better than humans because of their animal nature. Not only do they have animal ears and tails, but also certain abilities associated or prescribed to said animal. And I'm sorry, but unless there are rare cases, which in all due fairness is possible, I can't imagine a rational, sane human being to see a full-blown scorpion man or chameleon girl and go, yeah, I'm gonna bully them. That sounds reasonable. It's even worse if it's a full-on fantasy universe, where they could be demi-humans or even non-humans. Thank God all these races are usually just humans with a paint job, that don't have their own language, customs, tradition, religion, or biological differences. Otherwise, it would be very hard to exactly explain why people treat a race of much more taller, magically aligned aliens, for example, as routinely as we treat black people or Asians. Or why do these oppressed races usually have some semblance of Native American, African American, or Jewish in them? Really now, you don't see any Uyghurs or Maroons or any other people we oppressed over years getting a role. But then again, why am I surprised if the opposite side is some blown out proportions racism where poor elves are living in British concentration camps essentially for the fun of it? So, how to make racial prejudice more believable, you ask? Well, the quickest answer to this would be to look at historically oppressed people, preferably not only the trifecta I mentioned, and find some similarities between them. Believe me, you will find them almost immediately even a brief search. They will always have a culture distinct from their oppressor, and by distinct, I mean philosophically and ideologically different. There will always be a sort of language barrier. They also possibly have a common ancestry for the oppressor to think of them as inferior to them, or their lands were conquered. The hard way would be to just sit down and think about the race or people you're going to oppress. Why are they there? Where they come from? Why can't their oppressors just tax them and do nothing? This is also a thing that a lot of modern people, especially Americans, don't understand. Nationalism, the way you understand today, is a relatively new thing. Before, your average nation could easily be made of all sorts of people, and every village had their dialect, language, or even a belief system. You'll have to have something to justify why others are being dicks to them. Fortunately, the reason doesn't have to be very complex either. And in case you might ask, Auntie, why are you telling all this? The answer is simple. Boredom. Boredom and a bit of anger that comes from people underestimating or overestimating the value of world building. World building is hard, but the difficulties come from the quantity of work, not its quality. You can have the most generic world in the world, but as long as it's structurally coherent, people are gonna love it. What was I talking about again?
The coconut nut is a giant nut. If you eat too much, you get very fat. Now, the coconut nut is a big, big nut, but this delicious nut is not a nut.